Okay, today I want to talk about one of the three major nutrients, which is carbohydrates, the other two being fats and proteins. I've talked a lot about proteins in various videos. I haven't spoken much about carbohydrates. The first thing to consider about carbohydrates, which might surprise some people, is that carbohydrates are not essential in human nutrition. The reason for this is because some amino acids are termed glucogenic in the sense that they can be converted into glucose, which is the type of carbohydrate that circulates in the blood. They can be converted into glucose in the liver in a process called gluconeogenesis. In addition, triglyceride, which is the scientific term for fat, or the type of fat found in the body, for example, 1/3 of the triglyceride molecule is glycerol. 10% of the triglyceride structure is glycerol, and glycerol, not fatty acids, but glycerol can be also converted to glucose in the gluconeogenesis process in the liver. For these reasons, carbohydrates is not considered essential. Does this mean that it's not important for training? No. The preponderance, I should note right off the bat, most of the research on carbohydrates in relation to exercise and sports has been directed at endurance training, long distance running, that type of thing. And those particular sports, anything involving long distance running or extreme endurance training, definitely requires a greater intake of carbohydrate, and quite a bit of carbohydrate. For example, the Tour de France cyclists, they take in massive amounts of carbohydrate during the race. If they didn't, their muscles would lock up. You might sometimes, if any of you have watched the Olympic Games, sometimes if you watch some of the marathon runners, when they run out of glycogen in their muscles, glycogen, by the way, is stored carbohydrates, they experience a phenomenon called hitting the wall, where their muscles just seize up. They just won't work. Now, you'll say to me, well, what does all this have to do with weight training? Well, the truth of the matter is, when it comes to the research on weight training and carbohydrate, well, before I get into that, let me give you a couple of basics of carbohydrate. Each gram of carbohydrate has four calories. A gram of protein has 4 calories. A gram of fat has 9.5 calories. So carbohydrate and protein have about the same number of calories. Of course, they're metabolized completely different. Carbohydrates can be generally broken down into two main categories: sugars and starches. A couple of years ago, however, the picture became a little bit more murky with the publication of something called the glycemic index, which measured how long it takes carbohydrates to get into the blood after digestion. However, this glycemic index refers to individual carbohydrate foods. For example, let's take one baked potato. A baked potato has a high glycemic index number. In other words, the higher the number, the faster it gets into the blood. So theoretically, if you eat a baked potato alone, it's almost like eating a candy bar as far as the entrance of sugar into your bloodstream. However, as soon as you combine that baked potato with any other kind of food, let's say protein or some source of fat, the carbohydrate release from the potato is delayed, and the glycemic index drops like a rock. So be careful when you look at glycemic index, because again, it only refers to individual carbohydrate foods. It does not refer to the way most people eat, which is to combine carbohydrates with other nutrients like fat and protein, which considerably delays the entrance of carbohydrate into the blood. Uh, Now, as far as the research pertaining to resistance exercise, uh, weight training, a lot of people don't realize the main fuels of weight training is muscle glycogen. Again, muscle glycogen is a very large, complex carbohydrate consisting of thousands of branch chains of glucose, and this is the way carbohydrate is stored in muscles, and glycogen, to a limited amount, is also stored in the liver. The liver glycogen is available for systemic use. In other words, when your blood glucose gets too low, the glycogen can be broken down in the liver to release glucose to bring your blood glucose level back up. However, the glycogen stored in muscles can only be used by the particular muscles they're stored in. So once, let's say you're working your bicep, once you deplete the glycogen stored in your bicep, the fuel source is basically gone. However, when muscle glycogen is broken down through anaerobic or pathways not involving oxygen, Among the products released are what they call lactate. Actually lactic acid. The acid is disassociated from the lactate. So, but the lactate itself can travel in the blood. In other words, it's produced in the muscle as a fatigue byproduct of, let's say, working out with weights. The lactate gets into the blood, it travels to the liver, and lactate itself can be used in that same gluconeogenesis process, be converted into glucose, and then sent back to the muscle. That's called the Cori cycle. So indirectly, the muscles can provide a source of energy, even though the glycogen is specific for muscle. And the reason for that is because muscle lacks a certain enzyme that's needed to break down the glycogen for entry into the blood. Now, what about carbohydrates and weight training? As I said earlier, most of the research, if you look in the literature, involves endurance athletes. For example, the carb loading situation back in the 1960s, I think it was 1966, Swedish physiologists discovered that if athletes load their muscles with carbohydrates, they get extra amounts of glycogen stored in the muscle, which increases performance. Again, this relates to endurance exercise. The picture is much less clear with weight training. In the studies of weight training, depending on how hard you train and the volume of training, meaning how many sets you train, how many sets you do, and the frequency of training, that determines how much glycogen you kind of like burn off in the muscle. But they found that as little as 3 sets of biceps, for example, biceps curls, just curls alone, will deplete the bicep muscle of 24 to 37% of its glycogen content. And this raises the question, can consuming carbohydrates right before you work out or during the workout, can it increase your strength and endurance and workout performance? Again, the studies here are mixed. Most of the studies suggest that the carbohydrate or glycogen content of muscle is actually determined by your carbohydrate intake in the 24 to 48 hours before the workout, meaning that when you go to the gym, if you consume sufficient carbohydrate, and usually that amount for somebody involved in weight training is about 2.7 to 4.5 grams per pound of body weight, or it translates to about 55 to 65% carbohydrate intake in relation to total calories. If you eat in that manner, you will have sufficient muscle glycogen to power any amount of weight training theoretically. Another thing to consider is that you see these people walking around the gym with bottles, and they usually contain some sort of carbohydrate solution. And I think ostensibly that they probably think by drinking this, they're increasing or maintaining their energy levels while they're training. And is it true? In other words, is drinking carbohydrates while you're training helpful? Well, the first thing to consider is the concentration of carbohydrate in the drink. It should be no more than 6 to 8%. If the carbohydrate content goes over 8%, what happens is you actually inhibit fluid uptake. You can give yourself gastrointestinal distress, and you can actually get dehydrated. You actually block fluid intake. So you have to have it kind of a dilute content of a sports drink or a carbohydrate drink while you're training. But let's answer the question. Will sipping carbohydrates while you're training actually increase your strength and your endurance and the ability to do more reps? But here's the way it works. If your workout is about 1 hour or less, you probably don't need any carbohydrate drink at all. Again, the muscle glycogen that's already stored in your muscle from what you ate in the 2 days prior to working out is more than enough to power a workout that's under an hour. If your workout is 45 to 70 minutes, the recommended dose is about 30 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Now, the way you do this is you want to take about, what they suggest is to take about 4 gulps of the carbohydrate drink every 15, 20 minutes if your workout lasts 70 minutes. Now, if your workout goes over that, let's say it goes to 2.5 hours, now you want to go to 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate. And if it's over 3 hours, and I don't know why anybody would train in the gym for over 3 hours, that's gross overtraining. In that situation, you want to get about 90 grams. And now the thing is, what's interesting about that is science studies show that your body can uptake about 1 gram of carbohydrate per minute while you're training. However, in recent years, they found that if you combine two types of carbohydrate, let's, for example, glucose, which is a rapidly absorbed carbohydrate, or maltodextrin, again, a rapidly absorbed carbohydrate, if you combine that with a slow uptake carbohydrate, such as fructose, you can actually increase the amount of carbohydrate the body absorbs. So let's say you have a glucose fructose drink and a ratio of 2 to 1. That means twice as much glucose as fructose. If you consume that during the workout, instead of absorbing 1 gram of carbohydrate, your body will now absorb 1.5 to 1.7 grams of carbohydrate. But again, I want to emphasize, this really doesn't really make any difference unless your workouts are over 2 hours. If your workouts are an hour, consuming carbohydrates is not going to do anything for you, except for I'd say for one exception. If you're on a ketogenic diet or an extreme low carbohydrate diet, and you go into the gym with completely depleted glycogen stores, consuming that concentration of carbohydrate I mentioned earlier, which is 6 to 8%, and the 2 to 1 ratio of glucose to fructose, probably will maintain your glucose level enough where you'll be able to get a good workout, have enough energy and strength, even though you're consuming almost no carbohydrates. The carbohydrates will be burnt up in the workout, so it's not going to affect the low carbohydrate diet. In other words, it's not going to throw you off balance as far as fat loss. Two other things to keep in mind about consuming carbohydrates during training are, first of all, when you consume carbohydrates during training, you get a little bit of an insulin rise, and that prevents the use of fat as a source of energy. This is kind of a moot point because, again, weight workouts are anaerobic in nature, and they're powered by glycogen and glucose. Fat really doesn't play a role unless the workout, again, goes over 2 hours. So it really doesn't make any difference. The other thing to keep in mind is studies have shown that if you consume a diluted carbohydrate drink during extremely intense training, it'll blunt the release of cortisol during the training. Now, why is the cortisol released during the training? The cortisol is usually released to help release body fat. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. Why would you want to blunt cortisol during training? So what else can I tell you here? Let's see. Oh, they came out. I just want to mention there was a recent study, brand new study in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, where they tested the effects of acute carbohydrate ingestion on anaerobic exercise performance. This involved sprinting, vertical jumping, and weight training exercises. Now, here's the point to remember for those of you who are involved, and I assume most of you are probably not doing much vertical jumping, but you're probably lifting weights. What the study, without going into a lot of detail about the study, what they found was consuming 15 grams of 15 grams of carbohydrate per hour increased the performance dumbbell bench presses. In other words, you were able to do more reps in the final set. They somehow maintain your muscle endurance. So again, if you're training really intensely, even under an hour, maybe a small amount of carbohydrate consumed during the workout might help. Now, I just want to finish this off. Oh, by the way, muscle glycogen, that is your prime fuel for weight training. That can be considered let's say what is it called? The premier high test fuel for weight training. In other words, glycogen, basically, that's the thing to focus on if you want to have maximum energy and strength during training. Having enough glycogen in your muscle also increases muscle recovery. This is why you consume carbohydrates after the workout. And although you don't need to consume protein immediately after training, because protein synthesis occurs over 24 to 48 hours. It is a good idea to take in some rapidly absorbed carbohydrates within 2 hours after training, because the enzymes that power muscle glycogen repletion are primed after you train, and you'll get faster glycogen synthesis if you consume the carbohydrates within 2 hours after training. Also, if you train more than once a day, let's say you train twice a day, it's very important in between the workouts to have a carbohydrate meal to replace again some of the glycogen you burned in the workout. You'll get a much, much better workout and greater muscle pump. Also, some studies show that you have to have a certain amount of muscle glycogen available to stimulate certain anabolic processes in muscle, such as the production of intramuscular IGF-1, which is needed for muscle recovery and growth. So those of you who are on, let's say, ketogenic diets or diets that contain less than 20 grams of protein, be aware that it's not a good idea to stay on these diets all the time. If you want to use them to kickstart fat loss, that's great, but I wouldn't recommend staying on them more than 6 to 8 weeks, because after a while they're gonna interfere with muscle growth. So keep that in mind. And the final thing I want to talk about, I just want to mention in passing that the subject of muscle glycogen is extremely complex, and a lot of the nuances of, let's say, glycogen use in muscles is not fully known you won't see it in bodybuilding magazines or webcasts or websites. In my Applied Metabolics newsletter, and then I'd say the next couple of months, I'm not sure exactly when, I'm going to have a huge in-depth article on all the secrets of muscle glycogen, stuff that you never knew, never read, and how to maximize it, which will have tremendous effects on workout strength and endurance and recovery. And that's going to be in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. I'll finish off this video by briefly talking about a process, or what would I call it? A process that was popular in bodybuilding when I competed years ago. It was called carbohydrate loading. As I mentioned earlier, carbohydrate loading was originally developed in late 60s for use in endurance athletes. It involves supercompensation of glycogen stores in the liver by first depleting the body of glycogen by not consuming carbohydrates, and then for the next couple of days eating a lot of carbohydrate foods. And because the muscle's low in glycogen, you get a supercompensation effect where you top your muscles off and you get more glycogen than normal. It was used in bodybuilding because of the idea that each gram of glycogen holds 2.7 grams of water. And the idea was that if you first deplete the muscles by consuming very few carbohydrates, let's say about 2 or 3 days of extreme low carbohydrate, and then for the next 2 or 3 days eat a lot of carbohydrates, and this is like in the final week before a contest, you will wind up competing with very full, dense-looking muscles. And this was very, very popular. I really don't know if it's used that often today, but years ago, just about every competitive bodybuilder engaged in carbohydrate loading. But here's what the studies show. When you go on the low carbohydrate phase of carbohydrate loading, what you're doing is you're losing a lot of water, because when you don't eat carbohydrates, your body breaks down the muscle glycogen, and along with the muscle glycogen, you excrete all that water that's stored with it. So you basically kind of make yourself a little bit dehydrated. Now, what happens is when you add back the carbohydrates on the second 2 or 3 days, all you're doing is putting back the glycogen you lost and the water. And what they've done in some studies, they've actually took measurements of bodybuilders before and after using a carbohydrate loading, and there was no difference whatsoever. In other words, there was no size gains, there was no increase in muscle fullness. It was basically a placebo, not a placebo, it was real, but it was all in the bodybuilders' minds that they actually looked bigger. All they did is put back the water they had lost. And there is a danger with carbohydrate loading because, again, if you do it wrong, or let's say you consume too many carbohydrates, you can get what they call a spillover effect, where you wind up with a little bit of water retention under the skin, and this will obscure muscle definition. So you got to be careful with carbohydrate loading. And I really don't know whether it's still popular among bodybuilding competitors, but it's a kind of iffy proposition. It really isn't necessary. The last week, if you just eat normally and adjust your carbohydrate and protein intake accordingly, and your carbohydrates, your muscles will be already have as much glycogen as they need to attain a full look. For further information about carbohydrates, as I say, I'm going to have a great glycogen article, muscle glycogen article upcoming in my Applied Metabolics. I also cover nutrition of all types, supplementation, ergogenic aids, hormonal therapy, fat loss research, anti-aging, various subjects, 40 to 50 pages every month, no ads, pure information, no BS. It's a little more like a monthly ebook. Subscribe today, www.appliedmetabolics.com. Thank you for listening.